So thank you for that introduction. That's really nice. I'm going to flick to my slides so that you don't have to look at my face for this. Spay that. So here we go. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Let me know if not. So I'm Lewis. I'm a... Did you say you could see that there? Sorry.
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, sweet. So yep, I'm Lewis. I'm a GP trainee, part-time. I graduated back in 2012 now, which is hard to believe. And I started Geeky Medics in 2010, back when I was a fourth year medical student in Newcastle. And sorry, it's not letting me flick the screen. I originally bought geekymedics.com because I wanted to start a podcast back when podcasting was brand new and it had been added to iTunes so that people with iPods could use it. So it already sounds pretty old. And I got it for the bargain price of £6.06 apparently. And I took a screenshot at the time. So I was probably pretty excited about buying a URL. So the rationale behind this was to start a podcast in which a bunch of geeky medics sat around and chatted about what was the latest tech news that was going on at the time, because that's what I was into, because I was a massive nerd and still am. So I convinced a mate to record the first version of this podcast with me, and we chatted about various topics about what Google was up to and various other companies. And I listened to it on the way into university the next day, and it was really, really bad. It was just horrible to listen to. I can't imagine what it would have been like for anyone other than me to listen to it. So based exclusively on that preview of my podcasting skills, I decided that it was a terrible idea and that we should scrap it. So as a result, I still had geekymedics.com, but I didn't have anything to do with it. And I'd started a few personal blog websites over the preceding year, which of course nobody had read or cared about. So I was kind of hungry to start another website. And I thought doing something in medical education might be sort of a good way to sort of combine what I was doing at the time at uni with my outside tech interest. So I sketched out what the website might look like, and you can tell that I'm artistically challenged. My mum dug this out from the back of a drawer somewhere. And this was, in technical terms, this is a wireframe, although I didn't really know that at the time. So I sort of drew out the site and then realized I had to actually do the technology behind the website. So my computer doesn't want to let me do it again. So I had to figure out the tech. So the tech in this case, I went and looked on about 1 million different websites to figure out how I could get a website online. And it was more difficult back then, 10 years ago, than it is now. And I found this sort of new software called WordPress that allowed you to get a blog online without having to be a sort of tech genius. You had to set up a server yourself, which was quite a feat. But if you managed to do that, the software was pretty usable. So I hung around in the WordPress forums and sort of asked whenever I got stuck. And people were pretty, I don't know if they just took pity on me, I'm not sure, but they were helpful. And they helped me get over the various hurdles, because obviously I couldn't afford to actually pay a developer. And slowly but surely, I got the hang of how to get the website online and install the WordPress software, and how to tweak the theme that came with the software to make the website look more like I wanted it to look. And once I'd actually figured out the technology, so getting a website online, I had to then have some kind of graphics, because everything that I liked online was copyrighted, so I couldn't use it. And because I couldn't use any of these Swish graphics, I decided that I'd just create my own. And I was doing this is called pixel art. It's a kind of old school 8-bit video game style of artwork. And as someone who's artistically challenged as me, this is something that is feasible. So I decided to create various organs and devices using this art style, and use those as stand-in artwork for the website. And the idea was that if anyone actually used the website, I would switch these out for some Swish proper professional looking images. But as it would turn out, it sort of became part of the brand almost by accident. So this kind of style of artwork is still around to this day, for better or worse. So I had the graphics and I'd figured out the tech, and I had some notes. So I combined them and launched the website. So this is a screenshot of the early Geeky Medics website back then. And it was incredibly buggy back then and didn't have very many notes on there. And I was essentially just adding stuff that I was learning at the time. So Cushing syndrome, or, some notes on glomerulonephritis, etc. And, like I said, the website was pretty buggy. I remember spending probably like a day or two trying to get those blue boxes to align, and eventually gave up. And people thought the website was kind of useful. They enjoyed sort of using my notes rather than me having to send them Word doc versions via email. But then I started to do some OSCE type written guides because we were practicing for OSCEs at the time. And I realized there wasn't very much online from a sort of free OSCE guide point of view. There was a few paid for services and the quality of their content was pretty poor. And as I did the written guides, I realized that really we needed video demonstrations of the skills to provide value. And the competitors at the time were all paid for services, and the video quality was actually really, really poor. It was sort of a camera in the corner of a room, in the opposite corner of the room than where the patient and the examiner was. And you were sort of trying to infer what was going on, looking over the shoulder of the person examining the patient. So it was less than ideal. So I basically bought a camera and I bought a microphone, and I'd had some video production experience back when I was, sorry, I'm waiting for it to turn the screen again. There we go. So I managed to buy the camera and buy a microphone, and you can see me in my younger years there, looking much more youthful. Convinced two friends, Andrew and Colin, who were both medical students too, to act in the first two videos, switching between being the patient and the doctor. And it was a big ask at the time, actually, because YouTube was this sort of weird thing that medical schools didn't really understand. And there was a lot of questions about, if you were uploading YouTube videos, was that professional? So people were a bit wary of it. So it was quite a big ask of Andy and Colin to be in these videos and, to get topless and let me film them and then put that on the internet. So I'm sort of forever thankful that they took the leap of faith. And we recorded cardiovascular and respiratory examination in a room at one of the hospitals we were on placement at. And I then edited the videos and uploaded them onto YouTube. And, based on my experience of the fact that most of the other guides were paid for to access and the quality of the video was pretty poor, I thought people would like our videos. I felt quietly confident. But in actual fact, after uploading them, nobody was watching them. So I would go back like every few days and check, and the view count would go up by 1. So as a result, I realized that I probably had to do some kind of marketing of the videos. And being a massive introvert, the only way I thought of doing that was to go around various medical student forums at the time and post about the fact there was this website that I had and that there were some videos. And again, there was deafening silence for weeks after I posted on various forums. And then eventually I did get one reply from this person who they were sort of said the site was useful, but they kind of apologized for the lack of everyone else's interest. So it was a bit of a pity reply. But they did say that they would help spreading their word. So I took that as a positive after the silence and hoped that they would spread their word far and wide. And basically from that point onwards, I kept filming videos with friends for the various examination guides and sort of improving my filming technique and editing, and also kept adding notes to the website. And a few people I knew started to contribute some content as well. And slowly but surely, I can only assume through word of mouth, it began to spread that the website was helpful and more people started to use it. It definitely wasn't because of my marketing. And we've basically continued to grow organically since then. So as you can see, it was a slow start back then, but things have ramped up since. And, we now see over 3 million views of our content every month. And we've had over 100 million total views of our content, which I still, saying it sounds a bit surreal. And, YouTube wise, we've got 600 or so thousand subscribers, which again, I can't quite believe, but it's awesome. And you know, the numbers are the numbers, but the best part about all of this is that, you know, we've got this amazing community that's really diverse and it's from all over the world. So you can see the top 10 countries that use Geeky Medics there on the left. And these are just some examples of like community things that have happened. So some guys in the center there, they basically produced a printed out version of the OSCE guides. This was years and years ago now. And they sort of emailed me and asked if that was okay because the Wi-Fi was pretty crap at the university they were at in India. So I said that was fine. And then they sent me this sort of picture of the final product. I was slightly gutted that I didn't get a mention on the front of the page or anyone else for that matter. But I mean, I guess the binding process was pretty tough. So fair game. And up on the right there, that was a professor in Japan who translated our videos into Japanese and then used that for his students, which I thought was pretty cool. And then these are just other random emails. So somebody using it in South Korea, somebody else using it in Mumbai. So this amazing community is basically what gets me out of bed in the morning to work with Geeky Medics and has kept me engaged with it for the last 10 years. And, you know, later into the project, once I was sort of, I think 5 years in, I wanted an app from day one, but, you know, the cost of getting an app developer was really high. And I tried to learn app development myself and I built a really, really basic version of the app that I wanted, but it was really bad and really buggy. As you can see, there's a theme here. And I realized that, you know, to build the app that I wanted to build, it would take me years to get good enough to do that. So I had to hire someone. So I basically saved up the small amount of money we were making from YouTube, which was, you know, like £150 a month or something, £100 a month. I saved that up over the course of a couple of years. And then I used that to pay a developer to build the first version of the app. And I did the user interface design and all of the content input, everything I possibly could to reduce the cost of the development. And we launched our first version of the app, which was quite exciting at the time. I expected that maybe that would, you know, suddenly would be able to pay for everything. It would cover all of the costs, but I priced the app at £1.99 as lifetime access, and Apple takes 30% of that as well. So I got £1.40 per user. And I quickly realized that that wasn't even covering the costs of the ongoing development, never mind my time or anyone else's. So slowly but surely over time, I've increased that price to a point where we can cover all of the costs associated with the project. And this is really the main way that we fund all of the free stuff that we do. And then in terms of next steps, so we're obviously expanding our content library every week from our amazing community of contributors and editors, building out all sorts of interesting stuff around anatomy and surgical guides, etc. And we've also built out a platform called geekyquiz.com. So part of the issue that I ran into was that lots of people wanted to send us quizzes or questions for quizzes, and they would send me them in Word documents, and then I would manually extract them and put them into this really sort of janky plugin that would allow us to have a quiz on the website. And it was just really not streamlined, and it meant that lots of people's emailed quizzes just never made it out of my inbox. So the idea was to build a platform that would streamline that process and let people contribute questions to a community quiz bank without needing to go via our email inbox. So we built that out back in 2016, and then we quietly launched, and it was pretty bad, again, pretty buggy, pretty basic. It looked like this. So you can see my user interface design here wasn't my finest hour, but we took on feedback and we adjusted things, and now it looks much better. So this is the current version, and we actually have a totally new version coming out in a few months. So this now is a sort of collaborative community bank of questions. I think there's about 3,500 free questions there now, all contributed by community members. And what's quite cool is that, you know, everyone gets access to free questions, but also those people who do contribute get to get the stats back on how their questions are having impact. So how many times the questions have been viewed, in what countries the questions are having the most impact, etc. And they can even generate a little certificate to prove it. And we've also recently added flashcards to the platform as well, because who doesn't love flashcards? So that's exciting. It's one of the new projects. And also an interactive notebook that you can sort of add your own notes to. So those are all the sort of big focuses at the minute that are quite exciting. So I thought I'd talk through a few of the challenges that have, come over the last 10 years building this for anyone who's thinking about building something or is currently doing something in the sort of project business startup space alongside medicine. So number one is, probably the biggest challenge throughout the entire 10 years is time management, as I'm sure many people can identify with. So trying to build a project or company around, your studying, or when you start working as a junior doctor is really difficult because those, primary tasks take up most of your day anyway. So I think, you have to be really deliberate with how you spend time. You have to look at what you spend time on, and there's going to have to be some degree of compromise because you can't do everything. Clearly, your studies need to be the priority, but it might be that hobbies, etc., have to be reduced to allow you to work on these things. What I would say is do not use sleep as something that's negotiable that you can erode away at to buy time to work on your other things, because it's just not sustainable. And I definitely was doing that and guilty of it for a while, and it's not a good thing to do. So please prioritize sleep. Another thing that I really struggled with was remembering jobs to be done. So I had no system to manage tasks or emails. I just had a basic email app, and I was writing down things that I should do in my iPhone Notes app. And then I was surprised when I was forgetting to do things, or when I wasn't replying to emails and forgetting emails. So eventually, years later, I found tools that helped me do this. So I think it's really important to invest the time up front to choose tools that can support you. So for me, getting a better email app that allows me to sort of triage email, I use an email called Spark, which is free, which has been excellent. And I also use an app called Todoist, and that allows me to manage all of my personal life and business tasks in one place. So I basically just, whenever a task comes up, I just dump it straight into that app, and then it's out of my head. Because the problem I had when I didn't have a system, I would lay at night and it would all be whirling around in my head, and I wouldn't be able to sleep. And I'd just be constantly anxious that there was something I was forgetting. So by sort of sticking it all in there and then only dealing with a few tasks a day has helped me a great deal. So having those systems and having those tools is really important. The other thing that's really tough is deciding what to focus on. So in any given day, there are, 20 things that you could do that might help the business or project. But knowing what is actually going to make a difference and move things forward is really, really hard at times. And especially if you're like me and you have a bit of shiny object syndrome, and there's a new thing you could do that sounds really cool and really exciting, it's quite easy to get distracted on things that actually don't move your project forward. So choosing, a few things that are going to be your core focus is really, really important to try and keep moving forward. So for me, I have a sort of bird's eye view of the strategy for the next 6 to 12 months. And that probably has 5 things on it, 5 key goals. And then whenever I'm sort of doing things on a week-to-week basis or on a day-to-day basis, I look at the tasks I'm doing on that day and I think, are these actually getting me closer to the goal, those bigger goals? And if they're not, you have to kind of try and course correct based on that. So it's quite useful to have a North Star like that to guide you when you're in the midst of a million tasks and you could work on any one of them. And something else that I think probably people have experienced, I certainly did, is decision fatigue. So if you're running a project or doing anything like this, you often need to make lots of decisions, and these can be big, big strategic decisions, or they can be really small, minor details like choosing the color of a button on your user interface or choosing who to hire. And all of these things can be quite exhausting, especially when you're making lots of decisions every single day. And I think the danger, and this definitely happened to me, is you start to just make decisions just to get the decision done and out of the way and off your list. And that can really bite you if you let that happen, because you start making poor decisions, which then come back around weeks or months later and you regret making them. So now I'm quite conscious of the fact that if I'm starting to feel tired and I've made lots of decisions that day, I just delay other ones and wait until I'm in a clearer sort of space of time where I have time to actually think about whatever the problem is and make a sensible decision rather than just rushing it through, because it's just not sustainable to do that. Building a team is, some people find this super easy, and I see people doing a brilliant job of it, but it just did not come naturally to me. I didn't know how to do this well. And as a result, I worked alone for a lot of the time, for many years at the beginning, on lots of things that I could have just brought people in to help me with. And when I did first try and bring people in, I didn't really give them a clearly defined task that they should do. And I didn't provide any guidelines. I just kind of expected them to do things as I would do them, which obviously is completely ridiculous. And as a result, I set those people up for failure. And then I was, disappointed that they hadn't done the things I'd hoped they would do. And that put me off bringing people onto the team again. And then there was another period of time where I worked alone. So what I've learned, now is that actually, making sure that you have a clearly defined role for the person and that you provide appropriate support and guidelines, and you sort of externalize all the things that are in your head into guidelines, allows you to sort of set them up for success rather than just expecting them to be able to, read your mind and do everything the same as you would do. And I think it's important to realize that someone might not do something the same as you in the same way as you, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. And in actual fact, often that's where a lot of the advantages of bringing extra people on the team is the fact that they come at things from a different angle and can often do things much better than you ever could. So I think giving them a freedom to do it their own way is really important. And the final challenge, which is the common one, is obviously funding. So for me, I was working alone for a lot of it and doing all the various little bits. So I didn't have many people that I needed to pay initially. And what I basically did when I needed the app, which, I needed to pay someone, I saved up the YouTube money that was coming in, which is a small amount, but over time that added up. And then I used that to pay for the first version of the app. And then the money that I generate from the app, I used to improve the app and improve other things and pay authors. And then it's kind of gone from there. So I've basically just reinvested revenue from the business back into the business over time. And that kind of process is called bootstrapping. So it's different from getting external investment. It takes a longer time to get a project to a point where it can sort of sustain itself. But the advantage is that you don't give away any control. So those are the main challenges. And then just some final thoughts. So I think if you're thinking about starting something, it's really a good idea to start with a really niche market. So focus on a small group of people with a particular interest, ideally an interest that you are also familiar with. And what that allows you to do is you can sort of know what those individuals want from a product and then tailor the product to their needs. And the nice thing about this is that, number one, people within niches talk to each other generally. So if you're targeting medical students, they're more likely to talk to each other than if you targeted students in general. And the other nice thing is that you can often make a product that is better for that niche than whoever the big competitor in the market is, because they're generally trying to make a product for lots of people. And as a result, they neglect the needs of these smaller groups. So that's a good way of winning over your, initial customers or initial users and really delighting them. And then once you've got that solid base of users, you can think about expanding into other groups. But I think it's important to start on that sort of narrow niche market. And on a similar sort of angle, starting small is really important. So I get lots of people talk to me about starting some amazingly complex software product or whatever. And it's got a million features and it's going to be, the best things in sliced bread. But to build something of that level of complexity, you're probably going to need a lot of time, potentially a lot of funding and a lot of people. And with that comes a great deal of risk, because that means you're probably going to take a long time to build it. If you take a year to build something and then you finally show people it and show customers it and they don't want it, that's devastating, because you've wasted, a year, you've potentially spent a lot of money, and certainly you've spent a lot of time. So by starting really small and, taking your big idea of this really complex thing and distilling it down into the most basic, simple version, people often call that a minimal viable product or an MVP, is absolutely key. So what are the absolute essential things this thing needs to do to be somewhat useful? And then get that out into the market as quickly as possible so that you can get actual user feedback and determine if people actually want the thing you've built, and then adjust the product based on that feedback. And that's definitely what I've done from the start with Geeky Medics. And I've seen it be successful in other settings. I think the worst thing you can do is build in a vacuum over 2 years and then release it to the market and expect everyone to love the product. It's a really high risk. And I think, if you're thinking about a project, you probably hear lots about VC funding and lots of news stories about VC funding. And that's not necessarily appropriate for a lot of products. So venture capital really aims to pick companies that are going to be these enormous rocket ships that become billion-dollar companies, the Ubers of the world, etc. And the idea is, they put in £500,000 and then they get 10 to 20 times that value back out in 5 to 10 years. So if you're building a company, like Geeky Medics, where it's just never going to be at that scale because the market isn't there, then taking VC funding in that context is quite dangerous, because you could build a company that is completely sustainable and that, is generating, it could be generating tens of thousands of pounds, even hundreds of thousands of pounds, and it would still be viewed as a failure by those venture capital investors because it's just not going to give them the return on investment they wanted. And the problem then is you're in this awkward situation of having a business that sort of works, but that they view as a disappointment, and they start making you change the product to try and appeal to a wider audience, and that might not be what you want. So you sort of don't have the control that you would otherwise. So it's worth really thinking about whether venture capital funding is appropriate, because it seems to be that people assume that's just the default thing you do if you build a company, and it's not. And the way that I built Geeky Medics is obviously bootstrapping, as I mentioned, where you reinvest your own revenue, you try and generate revenue as early as you can. And what that allows you to do is maintain complete control over the project and to make sort of long-term decisions that aren't always directly related to making more money. So that's always nice. And then finally, I think don't underestimate the importance of founder product and founder market fit. So founder product fit is, do you enjoy working on the product you're working on? So, if you're a medical student and you really love medical education, but you've built an app for mechanics, for doing MOTs, and you just don't really care about mechanics or MOTs, it's going to be really hard to stay motivated on working on that product, even if it's being successful. And on a similar sort of note, founder market fit is, do you like the people who use your product? So, I really like the market that we have with medical students. But if you really dislike your users or your customers, again, it's quite hard to remain motivated and working on your project. And so many projects fail because people just become demotivated and don't want to work on it anymore. So trying to assess ideas based on whether you actually like the product and you like the market is really important, because you're going to need that to go the distance, to keep going when nobody else cares about the project or when there's a bump in the road. You need to have that intrinsic motivation to push forward. So having those alignments will help you on that front. Okay, I think that's enough of me waffling on. So now it's time for questions. So I will
Awesome.
let you go, Hajin.
Yeah, that was a very thorough and very informative list. That was really cool. Thank you very much.
No problem.
I'll just read out some of the questions that we'll put on the chat box. So our full stop asks, how much of your time is still spent focused on Geeky Medics now compared to your GP work?
Okay, yeah. So at the moment, I work 3 days a week in GP. So I'm on my final sort of GP now. I don't have any more hospital placements, so no more on call, which is quite nice. So I basically spend 2 days a week fully focused on Geeky Medics, and then often 1 day on the weekend as well, and sometimes 2 days on the weekend, and sometimes evenings after work. So still quite a lot of time. So I joke that I'm 60% part-time GP, but I'm 80% part-time Geeky Medics, because it kind of feels that way sometimes. So in short, I still work on Geeky Medics a lot, but I enjoy working on a lot of parts of Geeky Medics. So in some ways, it feels like it's a hobby as well as a sort of project/business.
So Chris asked quite a few questions, so I'll go back to him at the end. So John asks, can you speak a bit more about time management with medicine, working on these side projects, how to avoid burnout, which is a similar question to last time, I guess.
Yeah. So it's really, really challenging. And I found it probably the hardest time when I was in F1 and F2 and I was full time, because I would get home after doing like a 13-hour assessment suite shift. And then there would be emails from people, asking for their article to be put on the website or for, you know, a correction to be made. And I remember that being sort of the darkest time in terms of managing it. And the way that I tried to sort of hack things was that I tried to align goals between what I was doing at work and what I needed to do for Geeky Medics. So if I needed for my portfolio to demonstrate I understood ST elevation MI, then I would try and work on a piece for Geeky Medics that was on that topic. And then that would provide the evidence in my portfolio to meet the needs of the foundation program. And it would also move Geeky Medics forward. So wherever I could try and align things, that was sort of one of the few hacks. I know that's not going to be possible if you're not doing something in that field. And I think also just being very deliberate with the time that you have and see it as a really precious resource. So if you have 3 hours boxed in the morning on a Saturday to work on the project and it's going to be really focused, you can actually often get quite a lot done if you know that you've only got 3 hours to do it. I certainly find that being part-time is that even though I only have 2 days a week, I really get a lot done in those days because I know that that time is really precious. And I did have a year out where I was full-time on Geeky Medics, and I kind of thought, oh, well, I'll get twice as much done because I've got more than twice as much time. And I didn't. So I think there's something to be said about boxing time and getting things done. I think it forces you to do the important things and to maybe ignore the things that aren't going to move things forward.
Thank you. So R. asks again, it seems like there are a lot of medical education apps and companies now. If you're interested in getting involved in medical education, would you recommend going your own path or look to join an established group?
It's a good question. So I think I agree that there's so much, you know, from over the last 10 years, I've seen this explosion in the market, really. It's amazing. But what I would say is that people have quite different learning styles and learning needs. So in my opinion, that the market isn't a winner take all market. You know, they could be 10 companies doing the same thing, but students will find that, you know, one resource over another maybe speaks better to them in the style of it or in the type of material they produce. And often students want to use several different resources to cover each topic. So I think medical education is a bit of a weird market in that students will shop around and will use several vendors. So you don't necessarily, I would encourage you, if you're interested in starting something on your own, to think how you could have your own slant on a particular element of med ed and go for that. Because I think the bigger the community of sort of products and projects, the better it is for all students.
Awesome. So Will asks, what factors would you consider when deciding to get a co-founder versus going at it alone and improving your skill set instead?
So yeah, getting a co-founder, there's been many times that I've wished that I started with a co-founder who was sort of fully in it like I was, because I think emotionally having that other person there to just share concerns with and to bounce ideas off and to share the workload can really help. You know, we talk about time management, you know, one of the really effective ways to help with that is to have someone else sharing the load. And you know, especially if you've got complementary skill sets. So I think if you are choosing to work with someone, you want to make sure you have complementary skill sets. You don't want someone has the same skills as you, ideally, because that's not super helpful. So, you know, if you're really terrible at design and you're not particularly technical, but you're really good at creating content, then having someone who's maybe a developer with a bit of design is going to be really helpful. But, you know, getting co-founder relationships are fraught with risk because lots of companies fail because co-founders fall out. So you have to really view it as, you know, and treat it seriously like you would say a marriage, because, you know, you're making this big agreement with somebody to go the distance, and, you know, it could be over a really long period, and there's going to be tough times where you're going to have to be able to support each other through that, and you're going to have to be able to have arguments in a constructive way that doesn't blow apart the company. So I think really carefully about choosing a co-founder. I wouldn't choose a co-founder you know, from some random person on the internet. I would have to know the person and have worked with them for a decent amount of time beforehand. So think of it like dating. If you're thinking about maybe co-founding something, work on a small, little tiny project with that person and see how you work together, what the dynamic's like, and get a feel for whether you think this would be someone you'd want to do a more serious project with. But I think it's a really big, important decision, and having appropriate legal stuff in place where if things do fall apart, you're both protected is really important as well. And there's lots, if you Google sort of co-founder agreements, there's lots of templates that can help with that.
Awesome. So Nor also asks, in your opinion, is GP the best option for a medical student who wants to be an entrepreneur?
So I think the answer was a bit more, I would have been sort of more emphatically say yes a few years ago, because a lot of the specialties were less flexible. I think there's a culture shift happening at the moment. It's sort of in process where lots of specialties now are acknowledging that trainees do want more flexibility and want to be able to do things like less than full time, have other projects that they're working on, etc. So GP has kind of been that way for quite a while. So they're probably one of the most understanding. So to explain, I was given 60% less than full-time training to work on Geeky Medics. And I also was granted a year out of training, really no questions asked, which I worked on Geeky Medics and went to Melbourne and lived in Melbourne while I worked on it. And they've been really supportive throughout the process. So it's definitely, I think within GP, there's a sort of general understanding that people have other things outside of work that they might be doing. In terms of places that you need to explain yourself the least, it is probably the best. But I think lots of other specialties are moving that way. So I wouldn't do GP if you hate GP just because you think it would help on the sort of business front.
So we also have a couple more pre-submitted questions from other people. So I actually did ask you before talk started, how do people actually get hired for Geeky Medics, and like who films and how many people sort of are on board with the whole team and everything?
Yeah, sure. So I don't have like an exact number of the team, which I probably should off the top of my head, but it's a bit of a weird one in that we have some sort of regular people. So we have a few two editors who regularly edit content submitted by the community in collaboration with me. We have 2 or 3 developers that are contract developers. Everyone is sort of contract based, and it's based on the work they do in a given month, because obviously I can't really afford to have people on full salaries. It needs to be quite flexible, but people, I think, enjoy the flexibility on their side too. So we have editors, we have some developers. We then have, the Geeky Medics community, which a contributor might just write one article and that's it. And we have a whole pitch process for that on our Geeky Medics website on the editors list. And then we have people who contribute individual questions for the quiz platform. So we have this sort of really broad base of individual contributors, and then we have a small team of editors and people who feature in the videos, etc. And that's just a sort of as and when is needed situation.
Sorry. Yeah. So I actually almost forgot about Chris, who submitted a couple of questions. So the first question he asks is, how did you actually juggle between finishing your degree as well as learning and building a website? I think that's semi-been on, but yeah.
Yeah. So when I started the website, I sort of started it in my own time in the evenings and on weekends. And then at Newcastle, you could do a sort of specially selected component on something. And I applied to do it on Geeky Medics to work on a website. And it was a bit of a weird thing at the time to do that. And the medical school said no straight away. But I spoke to a consultant who I knew had started a website like 10 years ago, a random search engine. And he spoke to the medical school, and then they agreed if he was my supervisor. So I got sort of 2 weeks of time within medical school to focus on it. And that definitely helped sort of get things off the ground to sort of build it. But really, it was a nights and weekends project mostly. So I think if you're really passionate about it, you can enjoy doing that in that time. But I do acknowledge you need to focus on your studies first, because you don't want to fail your degree in pursuit of this. You need to just take your time with it. I think some people feel like they need to, when they start working on something, that they need to launch it like there and then, or like within a week or two. But if you take a longer term view and you say, okay, if I do 1 evening, 2 evenings a week over the next 6 months, at the end of it, I'll have something to release. And just don't put all the pressure on yourself to launch straight away. Take your time with it and enjoy it.
And the next question he asks is, was there anything that made you slowed you down, stop or slow you down? And how did you overcome that? And what sort of feedback did you rely on?
So I think probably initially I was slowed down by my technical understanding of like getting the website online. That took longer than it should have, but I just asked for help essentially in various forums as a way of doing it on the cheap rather than paying someone. And then I think probably something that slowed us down in the long run a lot was my inability to sort of recognize I needed to hire people, bring people on board, and delegate tasks appropriately. I was trying to spin way too many plates at the same time and not doing a particularly good job of any of them. And it was only when most of the plates started smashing that I realized that this wasn't sustainable. I was becoming really burnt out. And that's when I sort of gave it another go and tried to bring people on board. So I think trying to, build a team or have co-founders and delegate tasks between you is probably one of the most effective ways of moving forward more quickly.
And he also asks, can you see any gap in the current market where there is scope for coming up with a similar project to yours, bearing in mind there are professional websites, e.g. Pass Medicine, Osmosis, Pass Test, where students can subscribe and get much better quality than any fresh underdeveloped projects?
So I think that there's always gaps in the market. And like I was saying before, people like trying out new products and new projects. I think what you should do is think about how you could have a unique slant on a particular niche within these big things. Past Medicine has a million features and a million questions, but there might be some little part of what Past Medicine does that maybe isn't great. And you could maybe focus on doing a simple project that really does that sort of feature of theirs really, really well, much better than them, because that's all you're focusing on, and become known for that and then expand from there. So I think if you look at Geeky Medics or you look at any of these things, none of these companies are doing everything well because they can't, because as they broaden out, their ability to focus on all these things at the same time reduces. So that's one of the few places you have a bit of a unique advantage if you're starting out. You get to look at the market as it is, you get to assess all of the products, you get to see where their weaknesses are, and then come up with a thesis about something simpler that maybe you could build that addresses those problems in a better way. So I think there's always room for improvement, always.
Okay, thank you. So a couple more questions. So Catchy asks, has Geeky Medics continued to bootstrap, or have you since founded VC funding or angel investments? And if so, how was that experience?
So Geeky Medics has continued to bootstrap. The only funding that I got was I took a bank loan when we wanted to launch the Android app, because it was basically £7,000 to build the app, and I didn't have £7,000 in the bank to do that, but I did have a few £100 a month coming in. So the idea was that I sort of went to the bank. I had to come up with a sort of cash flow in Excel, which I'd never done, to predict what our revenue would be, which was totally wrong in the end, but they accepted it. And I got the loan, it was a few percent interest over the course of the next 2 years. I had to pay it back a few £100 a month. So that's the only funding that I took. And the nice thing about that kind of funding, it's not as, there's not going to be a news article that Geeky Medics has raised £7,000 from NatWest, but I got to maintain complete control over the business as a result. I paid back, I paid a few percent interest, a few £100 in interest, but ultimately it got me to launch the app, which then was able to repay that loan. You need to be careful with taking loans and things, of course, because you need to be quite confident that you can meet the repayments. So at that point, the repayments were probably like £200-300 a month, and Geeky Medics was generating maybe £1,500 a month. So I felt like there was enough margin for me to be able to pay the loan. Even if Geeky Medics dipped, I'd still be able to cover the payments. But I haven't taken any other funding, mainly because I like having the control, and I also don't think that Geeky Medics is a rocket ship that's going to, be a gajillion-dollar company. I wouldn't want it to be, because I don't think I'd enjoy running a company like that. I wanted us to do a few things really well and stick with our core audience, because that's where I get all my enjoyment.
Sure. Maddie asks, do you have any regrets / would you change any decisions you've made to get to where you are today?
So I think the main regrets that I have is things that I've spoken about. So not really bringing people on board well or early, and not delegating, because I think we went really slow at the beginning, and I put loads of stress on myself as a result of that, and felt really burnt out and pretty negative about the project a few times because of that. And I think also those people that I initially brought on and didn't do a great job of managing because I didn't really provide them with what they needed. I still feel bad about that. I wish I'd done that better, but I feel like I've learned from that now, and I'm, a much better manager, a project manager than I ever was before. But it's still an ongoing learning process. I'm not perfect.
Awesome. That was, I think that's all, most of the questions. If anyone has any final questions, please do pop them in the chat. But thank you very much, Lewis, for coming in to speak to us today. That was a very, very informative.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah. So, does anyone have any more questions? If not, we'll also
tumbleweed.
If not, we'll stop the recording as well.